October 1944. A muddy, disorganized transit camp in France. Hundreds of American soldiers wander through the freezing rain without their helmets, jackets thrown open, and boots completely unlaced. They resemble an armed, lawless militia rather than a disciplined military force. In the center of this chaos, an infantry captain lounges comfortably in a canvas chair, a stolen cigar clamped between his teeth, completely ignoring the breakdown of order around him. A newly arrived convoy of exhausted, terrified replacements pulls into the compound, staring in utter disbelief at the breakdown of basic army regulations. They look at their officers, then at the slovenly crowd, and feel the cold knot of panic tighten in their chests. General George S. Patton will soon teach this lazy commander that a breakdown in appearance is the first step toward death on the battlefield, using a brutal lesson that forces him to fix the mess with his own hands. This is the story of how General George S. Patton confronted an arrogant infantry commander who let his troops disintegrate into a lawless mob, proving that a failure in military discipline is a direct invitation to disaster. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show when the uniform was the only thing holding the army together. Private First Class Henry Evans was 18 years old. He came from the quiet, working-class streets of Gary, Indiana. He belonged to the G Company of the 328th Infantry Regiment. His father had served in the previous war, leaving Henry with a deep, almost religious respect for the military structure. Henry had enlisted the day after his 18th birthday, eager to prove himself, but the long, nauseating journey across the Atlantic, on a cramped troop ship, had stripped away his youthful illusions. He had seen the grim, silent casualties being loaded onto returning vessels at the docks, and he knew the butcher's bill in Europe was high. He had spent the last 48 hours sitting in the back of a freezing canvas-covered truck, clutching his standard-issue M1 Garand rifle with white knuckles. He desperately needed to see strong, competent leaders who could teach him how to survive the coming slaughter. Instead, he stepped out of the vehicle and into a chaotic swamp of military decay. Captain Gregory Miller was 28 years old and commanded the local transit detachment. He hailed from an affluent neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts, and had spent his pre-war years enjoying the unearned privileges of his family's wealth. He wore an expensive, custom-tailored wool officer's jacket, which he now left intentionally unbuttoned to look casual. Miller believed that surviving a single month of intense frontline combat in the autumn mud gave his men the absolute right to live and act like a band of lawless vagabonds. He openly mocked the very idea of regulations, famously telling his subordinates that neatness never killed a single German. He used his previous combat experience as an absolute shield to justify a profound, toxic laziness. He spent his afternoons sitting comfortably on a dry ammunition crate, puffing on a luxury cigar he had confiscated from a supply depot, watching the discipline of his entire unit completely rot away. The Allied advance across Western Europe relies entirely on a relentless mechanical rhythm. But behind the lines, that rhythm is breaking down. It is October 1944. A muddy, disorganized transit camp in France sits under a gray autumn sky, choked with freezing slush and heavy rain. Hundreds of American soldiers move through the mire, but they no longer look like an army. Men walk between tents with their combat jackets completely open, their heavy steel helmets unbuckled, and their leather boots entirely untied, slapping against the deep mud. Some wear civilian woolen scarves and stained sweaters instead of their issued uniforms. They look like a broken, defeated militia rather than a victorious force. Sitting on an unpainted ammunition crate near the center of the camp is an officer lounging comfortably in a canvas chair, watching the chaos with total indifference. General George S. Patton will soon teach him that a breakdown in appearance is the first step toward a breakdown in survival. Why Patton enforced strict uniform regulations to maintain discipline during combat operations. October 1944. A muddy, disorganized transit camp in France. Rain falls steadily onto rows of canvas tents. Hundreds of American soldiers move through the deep mire, but they look nothing like an army. Helmets are unbuckled, boots are untied, and civilian wool sweaters peek out from under unbuttoned field jackets. Men sit on crates, gambling and ignoring the officers who walk past. This total breakdown of basic military appearance threatens to turn a vital staging area into a dangerous, lawless mob. In the center of this chaos, an infantry captain lounges in a canvas chair with his legs stretched out. His boots are unlaced, and his tunic is completely open. He openly mocks the army regulations, claiming that his men have earned the right to relax. But a legendary general is already on his way to change everything. Patton will deliver a quiet, devastating lesson in discipline that these men will never forget. October 1944, a muddy, disorganized transit camp in France. Hundreds of American soldiers wander between canvas tents under a cold, gray drizzle. Helmets sit unbuckled on mud-caked tables. Untied boots drag through the thick brown slime. Men lounge in a mix of civilian sweaters and torn olive-drab jackets, looking more like an armed, disorganized militia than the United States Army. In the center of this chaos, an infantry captain lounges in a canvas camp chair, his own boots unlaced, a stolen cigar clamped between his teeth. He watches a truckload of terrified, fresh replacement troops climb down into the muck. The new arrivals stare in absolute horror at the breakdown of military order around them. But General George S. Patton is on his way to this camp, and he will deliver a devastating lesson on what happens when a leader forgets that a soldier who cannot lace his boots cannot be trusted to clean his rifle. Why Patton enforced strict uniform regulations to maintain discipline during combat operations. October 1944. A muddy, disorganized transit camp in France. Rain beats down on a crowd of American soldiers who look less like an army and more like a defeated militia. Helmets sit unbuckled on muddy tables. Half-buttoned jackets hang loose over civilian sweaters, and unlaced boots slosh through the deep mire. In the center of this chaos, an infantry captain lounges comfortably in a dry camp chair, his own uniform completely open, idly smoking a cigar. He openly ignores the complete breakdown of regulations around him, claiming that basic military neatness has no value in a theater of war. But an unexpected visitor is about to prove that a collapse in appearance is the first step toward a collapse in survival. General George S. Patton is on his way to this camp, and his reaction will permanently change how these men view the clothing on their backs. Private First Class Henry Evans survived the brutal winters of Europe, returning home to Ohio in late 1945. He left the military behind immediately, taking a job at a local machine shop where he worked for 42 years. He never forgot the cold mud of that French transit camp, often telling his children that the sight of a general enforcing basic order was the exact moment he realized he might actually survive the war. Evans lived a quiet, structured life, keeping his work boots impeccably clean until his death in 1993. Captain Gregory Miller was reassigned to a frontline replacement pool 3 weeks after the march. His record carried a permanent reprimand for neglect of duty, stalling his advancement for the remainder of the conflict. He returned to New York in 1946, working in commercial real estate, though he spent decades avoiding veterans' reunions and refusing to speak about his wartime service. He died bitterly in 1979, still complaining to his closest relatives about the day a 4-star general humiliated him in the mud. General Patton recorded the entire incident in a brief, dry entry in his personal diary that very night. He wrote that an officer who permits his men to look like beggars will inevitably lead them to fight like beggars. In a letter to his wife a week later, he noted that victory is not won by brilliant strategy alone, but by the daily tedious grind of enforcing obedience when the men are too tired to care. October 1944, a muddy, disorganized transit camp in France. Hundreds of American soldiers wander through the freezing rain, their uniforms completely stripped of military discipline. Unbuckled helmets clatter against unlaced combat boots, while open wool jackets reveal a chaotic assortment of civilian sweaters underneath. Men lounge on fuel cans, smoke cigarettes, and ignore every standing order regarding basic military appearance. To a casual observer, this critical rear echelon hub looks less like a modern fighting force and more like a defeated, armed militia waiting for the war to end. In the center of this breakdown, a lone convoy of heavy trucks grinds to a halt in the deep mud. A fresh group of replacement troops steps out into the rain, clutching their clean rifles, and their faces instantly pale. They see complete chaos. But General George S. Patton is already on his way to this camp, and he is about to deliver a brutal lesson that these men will never forget. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have given the exhausted combat veterans a pass and let them rest? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when the uniform was the only thing holding the army together, make sure to subscribe.